So I love maps, and I'm really interested lately in local history. And I happen to live in the Wellington district in the north side of Nanaimo. And so I wanted to check things out and know a little bit more about the history of the area. And of course, Robert Dunsmuir figures quite prominently in the whole history of this area. And his story is quite well known. The thing that I got very curious about was reading about how he got started in his own coal business in Nanaimo. And the legend goes, and letters and documents exist that are quite well known and covered in various books over the years, about how Robert Dunsmuir was visiting Diver Lake in October of 1869 and had discovered some coal there, and how things progressed from there. A lot of the books really don't give any detail on exactly where things were started and exactly where things were found, and how things progressed as far as him accumulating the rights and the lands and building up the business in a great deal of detail. So I got interested in that, and I thought I'd make a video to cover what I think I've been able to learn about it, and show a few interesting things on maps, and potentially get some comments about what other people might know about the history of it, and learn more about through sharing this video. So on this map we see the districts as they exist today, and they have existed that way for a good long period of time, well over 150 years. And on this next slide, we'll see how those districts were laid out. They were laid out between 1858 and 1860. This is prior to British Columbia and Vancouver Island joining, which happened in 1866. So Vancouver Island was itself a British colony at the time. And this little clipping from a paper that was written by Mr. Taylor from the BC Land Surveyors in 1975 points out that these surveys were done on Vancouver Island, and that often the surveys of the lands were done in 100-acre blocks that were 20 chains north to south, 50 chains east to west, and there was a grid of these things laid out in a lot of areas, although that wasn't consistently done in every area. Now, on the next slide, what we see is a modern-day map of the area that I'm interested in, which is really the boundary between the Wellington district that we just saw and the Mountain district, which is directly to the south of it. And that boundary line actually splits through Diver Lake. Now, Diver Lake is important from Robert Dunsmuir's perspective because it was at Diver Lake where he was fishing in October of 1869, and he was off for a walk. And that's when he apparently had made his coal discovery and sort of had kicked off his whole but that was the genesis of his empire, essentially. And so the next slide shows where those district lots were laid out in those 20 chain by 50 chain rectangles. We see those rectangles are quite prominent to the south of the split line, which is the Mountain district. If we see that east-west line that goes through Diver Lake, we see all these section 20s, and below that section 19s and so on towards the south. That's all Mountain district layout in that grid. And then to the north of that line, which is the Wellington district, we see a few of those 100-acre rectangles. For example, we see just to the northwest of Long Lake, we see section 4, range 4. But otherwise, the parcels in the Wellington district were laid out in quite an unusual way, and Robert Dunsmuir has a lot to do with that, it turns out. And so we'll check on the next slide. This is actually Robert Dunsmuir's first land grant, and this land grant was granted to him January 20th, 1872. So presumably what appears to have happened is in October of 1869, when he made his discovery, he established rights to start to extract the coal. He got mineral rights, and he made some kind of a preemption record so that he could occupy the land and start his business. And the rules work so that you would improve the land for 2 years, and then ultimately you would be able to obtain the Crown Grant. What we're looking at here is the map, in fact, from the Crown Grant. As I say, January 20th, 1872, this land was granted to Robert Dunsmuir and his partners. And there are a few very interesting things that are revealed in this land grant map. One is on the far western edge, we see that little sort of jogged section, and it's written swamp, and then there's a little dot and it says coal mine. And we'll take notice of that. Another interesting thing is that between Diver Lake and Long Lake, we see that the southern boundary of this parcel, which is listed there as 131.95 acres, is the Comox Road. And of course, the Comox Road, we know Comox Road today in downtown Nanaimo, a little section of it is called Comox Road, and it continues to the northwest as Bowen Road today. But back in those days, it was still all called the Comox Road. It wasn't changed to be called Bowen Road until the 1950s. Prior to that, it was still the Comox Road, and it was alternately known as the Comox Road or the and for a period of time after this, the Wellington Road, that section sort of colloquially, but officially it was the Comox Road. And so we know that little section of Comox Road today as Norwell behind the Country Club Mall. And we'll look at how that evolved here in a second in some of the further slides that we have with these different composite maps. And then the other very interesting thing that we notice here is it's shown in red this proposed tramway, which follows the southern edge of Long Lake, more or less, towards the east, and then it continues more or less due east with some curvature, presumably following the lay of the land, out towards Departure Bay, and it goes through what's called the Hughes preemption and ends up with a little section right on the water at Departure Bay at the north, sort of the north, I guess you'd call it the northwest curve or corner of Departure Bay, and that's where the Wellington wharves were in fact built. The Wellington coal mine wharfs for Dunsmuir were in fact built. And the whole story with his interaction with Hughes makes some interesting detail, which we might go into in a future video. But on this video, I want to concentrate mostly on the map. So the next slide, we have that same land grant from 1872 January shown in a more faded fashion so that we can composite other maps into it to align it with other pieces of information that we know in a modern sense and throughout history, which I find interesting, and it helps us sort of reveal a few other details about what went on with the early days of Dunsmuir as his coal mines progressed. And the next slide composites over top of that land grant a modern plot of all the lots within the city of Nanaimo land district, or the city of Nanaimo city limits. And immediately we notice that a lot of the city lots that we have today are bounded by those same boundaries that affected things like the Mountain Land District and Wellington Land District, that east-west line. It's forming that boundary of a lot of those lots, and it forms the boundary to the north of these larger sections of parks and golf courses and such now. And we also notice that the modern roads where they align, they align and they reveal some of the history of what was going on at the time. And so on the next slide, we've got the extra little bit of highlighting that points out an interesting thing. Of course, this is the modern layout and alignment of roads. But the red highlight is, if we follow it from the south, the lower edge of the map, and go north towards the northwest, that is currently Bowen Road. We see it cross Northfield there at that major intersection. We continue north and it crosses various streets we're familiar with until ultimately it comes to the Island Highway, the old Island Highway, at the Country Club Mall. As it crosses and we go north, it follows in through, becomes Norwell Drive, and as I said earlier, it curves behind the Country Club Mall, and it comes around back to the highway, and it crosses where they've got the pedestrian overpass now at Jinglepot, turns into Jinglepot, and then it curves immediately to the right, and it follows the course of what is now called Wellington Road, which was in fact, back in those days, still called the Wellington Road, which was, as I say, an alias for the Comox Road. And it curves up, as we see there, and it rejoins the alignment of the Old Island Highway towards the northwest up. And you could continue on, even back in those days, along that wagon road to Comox. And so that boundary of the southern edge of Dunsmuir's parcel there was the older alignment, which was slightly to the south, as we'll see here in a moment, of the Comox Road, but it still exists today. And if we travel Norwell, we are more or less traveling that boundary as it was defined in the early days of Robert Dunsmuir. The other one that I've highlighted here is in the magenta color, and that is, of course, modernly known to us as Departure Bay Road, which starts on its western edge at Norwell behind Country Club Mall, and you can follow it along and you get all the way to Departure Bay. And as we see, we can kind of see it here a little bit with that red proposed tramway, that this really is the railway bed of Dunsmuir's coal train. If we travel the modern Departure Bay Road from Norwell out towards Departure Bay, we are in fact traveling, to a large part of it, the exact same railway bed that those trains carried all that coal in through the late 1800s out to Departure Bay. And so on the next slide, we flip back to the original land grant, just to sort of get our bearings again. And we'll notice if we if we follow the Departure Bay Road today, we'll notice that there's that ravine with the creek just to the south of us. So that, that is consistent with what is shown there. And again, we see the Comox Road just to the north of Diver Lake that is defining that sort of southern boundary of this land grant to Robert Dunsmuir. Now, the next slide I wanted to show is a coal map from 1947. This was produced by the province of British Columbia, and it really is a summary of all the different coal mining that ever went on in the Nanaimo area generally. And that I've overlaid with a couple of other interesting things here on the subsequent slides. So we'll move on to it on the next slide here. So we've got a zoom in of Robert Dunsmuir's land grant, and a composite of that plus the BC government's 1947 Nanaimo coalfield map, and a small extract of the legend from that coalfield map. And we'll notice a little highlight that I've got there. On Robert Dunsmuir's land grant, there's a little that right on that edge there is where there was that little spot circle where it said coal mine, and we see that there's this it looks like a little sort of pitchfork that's pointed towards the right or towards the east with the number 4 beside it that I've highlighted. And number 4 is listed as R. Dunsmuir and Sons, Wellington Colliery. This is Dunsmuir's original entry. And this is quite definitively, given that it's shown in 1872 as the location of the coal mine, and it's shown in 1947 as the original entry of Robert Dunsmuir, we know, and it gives us a big hint as to why the edge of his land grant was given that little jog there, because obviously that included the land that was necessary for him to actually have the entry into his initial coal mine, which entered essentially from the west, and it went in towards the east, and right where that number 4 is now. Well, if we overlay the current Nanaimo land parcels and the layout of everything that we know in modern Nanaimo over top that, and I've got the little red dot where the point of that number 4 pitchfork went, we see that it is directly under the bed of Jinglepot Road, just to the south of the new Nanaimo Parkway. The new Nanaimo Parkway opened in 1997 in the spring, and all of that construction that went on there through the mid-1990s when the parkway was being constructed, that was moving land and establishing the new Parkway roadbed right over top of the exact original Dunsmuir coal mine. And if we want to take a look at that, we can look at it in the Google Street Map and the 2D view, which we'll do here in a moment. And we're going to leave it there. I'll just end off this video with a little bit of a view of it from the Google Earth view, and just check out a few things that we'll notice here. For example, we've got an old road here. It's called Old Slope Place. And the old alignment of Jinglepot, which obviously went all the way through from the Old Island Highway through to the Jinglepot south of the modern Parkway, we can kind of get that from looking at just the way things are aligned here. But that original Robert Dunsmuir coal mine entry is essentially directly under the roadbed of Jinglepot today. That's all for this video.